Welcome to the webinar on the Healthy Farm Index. In this webinar, we will talk about what the Healthy Farm Index is and how it can be used to improve management on your organic farm. The outline for the webinar today can be broken into 4 sections. First, we want to define where the Healthy Farm Index fits in other ways that that farmers or land managers might manage and monitor change on their farm. Second, we would like to speak about why you might plan and monitor for biodiversity and the associated benefits, in particular ecosystem services on your farm. We want to demonstrate a new online web app version of the Healthy Farm Index that we've now built. And lastly, we would like to connect this back to the USDA guidelines on biodiversity and natural resources. The webinar can be viewed both in a long form, but you can also view it where each of these individual sections is broken out and as shorter clips. This might be particularly valuable if you're familiar with other assessment tools. You could skip immediately to number 2, or if you are already familiar with what biodiversity and ecosystem services are, you might watch clips 1 and 3. The Healthy Farm Index has been an ongoing project for approximately 8 years. There's multiple articles available to read about the tool broadly, but in particular, the motivation for the tool emerged from this interest in how do we balance biodiversity conservation on farms with the necessity that farms maintain viable crop production. These articles are available on the website or upon request. More recently, we've published a user-friendly version of the guide through the University of Nebraska Extension. This NEB guide goes through and talks about the specific indicators, why it might be useful on the farm, and it has a PDF at the end that you could use as a form to fill out the Healthy Farm Index. More particular, what we want to share today is the Healthy Farm Index web version. This is an online interactive tool that can be used to walk you through the Healthy Farm Index, what it is, why it's valuable. The link is available on the Organic Center. The Healthy Farm Index, though, fits into this broad array of different farm assessment tools, including assessment tools that focus on soil conservation, water conservation, profit, and other aspects of a farm. What we noticed in our review of this, though, was that biodiversity and ecosystem services were something that were lacking in terms of farm assessment tools. These existing assessment tools include the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, the Stewardship Index, a monitoring toolbox from the Land Stewardship Projects, and these tools all provide direct value to the farmers. But like we said, they lacked specificity for biodiversity and ecosystem services, so we saw a gap in this kind of array of what tools were available to farmers. There are assessment tools that do focus on biodiversity and ecosystem services. However, they are typically targeted at a larger scale than the individual landowner. So the Natural Capital Project is typically a regional, has their INVEST program, which focuses on regional change. And Iowa State has their watershed scale management tool, which has some similarities, but is a larger scale tool for monitoring change in biodiversity and ecosystem services. So the Healthy Farm Index fills this niche in assessment tools for farms that we felt was needed. In particular, it focuses on the farm scale. We thought this is important because this is the unit of land that an individual has direct control over. They get to make most of the decisions on their property. And so ultimately, it's a unit that is very functional for monitoring and planning. The Healthy Farm Index focuses on biodiversity. In particular, this focus on what should farms maintain. So can farmers and farmland contribute to regional biodiversity conservation? We tend to think of this as agriculture for biodiversity. And then the complementary part to this is how can biodiversity benefit agriculture? So this is the concept of ecosystem services, which are the benefits that society receives from nature. So what processes should a farm provide both to the farm itself, but then to the larger ecosystem and other communities? In terms of what is biodiversity, biodiversity can be broken down into different components. For the terms of the Healthy Farm Index, we focus on genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. Genetic diversity is essential for designing new varieties of crops that can withstand drought tolerance, that maybe are resistant to different outbreaks from fungus. So at the top, we see some wheat breeding trials from some of our organic research in Nebraska. And the banana is kind of the classic example of a species that is threatened because of the lack of genetic diversity. The bar plot on the other side of the opposite the banana demonstrates the potential economic value of genetic diversity. So this is how much is it worth? And the reason including this figure here is we see that genetic resources are among the most valuable provisioning or services that provide direct benefits to society. Genetic resources are shown in the blue bar, and you can see that it is 3 to 4 times greater than the value of food production alone. Species diversity is the next scale up, and on the Healthy Farm Index, we consider both planned and associated biodiversity. So planned biodiversity is the diversity that a farmer deliberately chooses to put on what they plant. Do they include windbreaks? How do they manage that land? We also include associated biodiversity. In our case, we focus on birds, plants, and pollinators. And so these can include songbirds, it can include bees, it can include wildflowers. But these are things that typically a farmer doesn't deliberately plant or manage for, but are influenced by the farm scale choices. And then we consider ecosystem diversity. Farmland is one of the most ecologically diverse land use patterns. We tend to think of it as a homogeneous landscape, but the reality is if you look both within a region, but globally, you see lots of different land use and ecosystem types when we kind of scale up and look at the farm as a whole. Here we see 6 different agro-ecosystem types, everything from Minnesota in the top left to Bolivia in the bottom left and Germany in the top right. With the Healthy Farm Index, we want to try and capture some of this complexity so that it can be shared and communicated. Biodiversity and ecosystem services go hand in hand. And so ecosystem services we talked about are these benefits that we get from society. Ecosystem services flow from planned biodiversity and associated biodiversity. Planned biodiversity, again, we mentioned, are the things that farmers, the deliberate choices you might make. So did I include livestock in my operation? How many crops did I plant? Did I include cover crops? And associated biodiversity, the bees, the plants, the pollinators, the birds that arrive or choose to use the farm depending on how the landscape is managed. And both of these ultimately come back to the decisions made by the farmer. And so you can think of agro-ecosystem management are those daily choices or weekly choices or annual choices as to what should I do with my farm. Importantly, they create conditions that promote biodiversity, both planned and associated, which ultimately provides the ecosystem services to us. We haven't specifically mentioned what ecosystem services are beyond the benefits we receive from nature. Ecosystem services are broad. Some are global in scale, like climate regulation, and some are more local, like cultural or pollination. But importantly, these are benefits that farms, individuals, cities receive from nature, from biodiversity at no cost. The estimated global value of ecosystem services is approximately $125 trillion, which approaches more than double global GDP. If we look more specifically at agricultural ecosystems and ecosystem services, we can see how ecosystem services get broken down into supporting services, which kind of underlie and support ecosystems, regulating services, which regulate different patterns or regulate ecosystem function on the farm. So this can be everything from retaining soil, water purification. These are benefits provided to the farm, and you can imagine trying to manage those to enhance the profitability of your land, enhance the sustainability. You can also think of ecosystem services as something coming from an agricultural ecosystem. So if we look on the right side of the figure here, this includes food and fiber production, which are kind of the classic outputs that are part of a farm. But there's also non-market services. So again, we can focus on soil conservation, which we'll come back to a little bit later, wildlife habitat, the beauty of many farmlands. And also this figure is important because it does acknowledge that there are disservices provided both to and from farms depending on how they're managed. So nature is complex. I mean, there is damage from pests, there's competition. But we also know that farms do create habitat loss and disrupt ecosystem function. So I think it's good to find that balance, but the Healthy Farm Index allows us to really focus on these benefits to the farm, but then also these other non-market services that often get lost in monitoring or planning and communicating what farms do well. So the question, why should we plan for biodiversity and ecosystem services? Farms already are complex to manage. The question of what to plant, will it be profitable? How are the markets going to change? So why would we want to add something on top of this to the daily or annual maintenance of a farm? The one compelling argument is this idea of ecosystem services, where the management of the farm is going to dictate what benefits you get from the farm. And so everything from here, what should I plant this year? Should I cultivate? Should I plant windbreaks or include conservation buffers? Dictates biodiversity patterns, which dictates these ecosystem services. These ecosystem services can enhance productivity, they can enhance profitability, and they can ultimately make the farm and the larger landscape more sustainable. Another reason is that biodiversity is being lost at a global scale. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment suggested that we are losing species at 1 to 2 orders of magnitude greater than the normal background extinction rate. And what we can connect this to is the idea of planetary boundaries, or the thresholds of change when ecosystem disruption negatively impacts human health and well-being. In this figure on the right, we can see different planetary boundaries, things we might track and change. Areas within the green suggest that we are within a safe operating space, where yes, we've disrupted the system, but human health and well-being can still be maintained. The 3 systems that have crossed the planetary boundaries are the nitrogen cycle, climate change, and then on the top right, we see biodiversity loss, which has crossed that planetary boundary to the greatest extent. Those 3 changes, and in particular biodiversity loss, have been driven by agricultural change. This map summarizes lands used for rangeland and cropland at a global scale, while all the areas in brown are dedicated to the production of food and fiber. And to kind of help summarize that, you can think if we took all the lands dedicated to range, that's the total continent of Africa, and the total area dedicated to cropland would fit in the area of South America. At an estimate, it's about somewhere just under 40% of terrestrial ice-free surface is dedicated to farming and food production. So if we're going to work to address that biodiversity crisis, working with farmers to monitor how their farms contribute to conservation is essential. Focusing on organic, we can actually see that organic farms can provide food, but also protect biodiversity. One of my predecessors at the University of Nebraska, she worked on a project that compared bird abundance and diversity in organic and non-organic land. So we can see in the figures on the left, the white bars represent organic, the black bars represent non-organic, that there was 2 times as many individual birds and 2 times as many species in organic and non-organic farms. At the same time, within organic farms, and some of my research is focused on what specific practices, how can the land be managed within organic farms to increase diversity. And one of those that we see is that small fields with intermittent patches of non-crop habitat can increase the abundance of a number of different species, including species like the threatened Bell's vireo, or important insectivores like the eastern kingbird. These demonstrated benefits of organic farming to biodiversity are pretty consistent. This is a summary from 2005, looking at the number of studies that have compared organic to non-organic systems and the number of studies that showed a positive increase. For more recent literature reviews have shown the same pattern. And many of the cases where there isn't a positive, it's a neutral. So working with farmers to understand how their farms can contribute to biodiversity and motivating biodiversity conservation on farms is essential given the global extent of agricultural lands. And we can also come back to ecosystem services. In that same assessment of the health of biodiversity from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, they looked at the health of the different ecosystem services. Food production has continued to increase. However, our production of food has come at the cost of these other ecosystem services. So again, if we want to focus on sustainable landscapes, sustainable farms, continuing to increase food production is important, but at the same time, we need to find a way to balance food production with our other ecosystem services. We can look at the ecosystem service value of these different regulating and supporting services. And I think this kind of highlights some of the maybe missing components, or how we often don't realize how important something is. In this figure, it's the different regulating and supporting services and their relative economic benefits. I like to point out, we can look at here, pollination is in the maroon, but as compared to some of these other supporting and regulated services, despite all the press it gets, it's one of the less economically valuable services. That doesn't say it's not important, but I think what I want to highlight here is the relative importance of erosion prevention and how economically important that is. And when we think about farms, a well-managed farm can reduce erosion. However, a farm that is not as well managed, you can, whether because it's only planted one crop, we can see the corn here, or just loss slowly over time due to different changes in stream flow, rainfall patterns. Now, erosion can cause major damages to the farm, but also over time that impacts a larger watershed and ecosystem. And we can look at benefits, that solutions that target ecosystem services. In particular, here we can think of soil erosion. So we have this nice buffer strip here in the middle of the field, which is going to help mitigate the negative impacts of soil erosion. But it provides habitat for pollinators, can improve the matrix or the habitat quality of the larger farm for birds. And so we want to help farmers identify how these simple practices ultimately benefit their farm and benefit the larger watershed and ecosystem. So that's, I hope, relatively compelling. And there's really good evidence out there that if we can learn from natural ecosystems, like we can see here on the left, and find a way to balance the benefits, the ecosystem services that we see here from natural ecosystems with the benefit of crop production from intensive cropland. We can move towards farmland, agricultural landscapes with restored ecosystem services. And given the amount of data, and given the evidence, and given the research that's been done, on one level, this should be a relatively straightforward process. However, the reality is that it's not. Just knowing something, having this knowledge of change is not all that it takes. Creating behavior change is a more complex system than that. And so we kind of move towards this suggestion that understanding that some action taken on the farm can improve the system, or that doing something causes harm, doesn't necessarily change the behavior. And so if those two aren't connected, what needs to be changed in the middle? And this is kind of where the Healthy Farm Index becomes a tool for larger change in an ecosystem or in a region, but really focused on the individual farmer rather than the landscape or the farm itself. And so what we see here is this, we can think of the awareness of consequences was what we see here at the top. And over here we see the environmental behavior. So this is a pro-environmental behavior. So having a longer crop rotation, or including buffers as part of your farm, or setting aside land for pollinator or bird conservation. Between this awareness of the consequences of what are the consequences of erosion, we have multiple other attributes of the system that we have to identify. There's the norms of the individual. What do they do on a daily basis? What do they talk about? There's the larger social norms of the community they're embedded within. There's attitudes about different aspects. And then ultimately the perceived ability, the perceived behavioral control. So can I do something about this or not? If we start thinking about how do we move from these statements that ecosystems are threatened, species are being lost, ecosystem services are being disrupted, to adopting these pro-environmental behaviors, we can't just say this is how it should be. We need to identify and work within these kind of intermediate steps. And so one way to do that is to plan and monitor more deliberately. Where, can we change the intentions? Can we change the social norms? Can we disrupt attitudes that currently exist by having value-driven objectives that are agreed upon by a group or through collaborative discussions, targets that and monitoring that allow farmers to change the perceived behavioral control, and then ultimately maybe can we create habits that dictate what environmental behaviors are possible. And so we see the Healthy Farm Index as a planning and monitoring tool that ultimately may increase pro-environmental behaviors. And what I want to talk about here is how we kind of walk through the Healthy Farm Index and focus on objectives, targets, and indicators. These, again, like we mentioned before, there's a couple of ways to actually use the Healthy Farm Index. One is the extension NEB guide that should be available soon, and hopefully in the next month. And this has a lot of detailed information about the indicators and kind of walks you through it. It is focused in some respects on Midwestern systems, but we've designed it to be flexible for whatever agricultural system you're working within. What I want to talk about today is our web version of that, which follows a similar structure as the NEB guide, but is a little bit more dynamic in how a farmer or planner or land use manager could interact with it. When putting together the Healthy Farm Index, we've kind of set what some of the objectives are. We focused on environmental, social, and economic objectives. Objectives are broad, value-driven statements, and so these can be everything from conserve biodiversity to enhancing engagement with the community, or with your neighbor or with the land itself. We focus on how can we decrease expenses or increase stability on the farm. We've chosen on the web version to focus these objectives into biodiversity and ecosystem services to kind of align with some of the concepts we discussed earlier, where we want to conserve plant and associated biodiversity. So can we conserve crop diversity? Can we conserve bird diversity? And we want to kind of monitor that change over time, and then ultimately want to enhance food production, maintain that essential economic component of the farm, improve soil and water quality, and ultimately improve satisfaction with the farm itself. Within those objectives, we've gone through and selected potential indicators that we think reflect the priorities of the farm, but that are flexible enough to work on any farm and are relatively easy to monitor. You can spend a lot of time and money getting better data, but we wanted indicators that were either already part of a typical farm monitoring or management process, or that were relatively easy to collect. And so we started out, as we mentioned before, interested in the trade-offs between bird diversity and crop yields. We quickly realized that that did not capture the system of a farm and all the potential indicators that were within there. And so we added a number of other indicators to the Healthy Farm Index, and more information of these is available in the different papers. And we'll kind of walk through some of them when we look at them on the farm. With the Healthy Farm Index, the indicators are provided. What the farmer has to do is choose what the specific targets they have and what they want to reach for those. So what I want to do here is switch from the PowerPoint slides here and actually go to the web version of the tool. The Healthy Farm Index calculator can be found at this website on the bottom for the Organic Center. And I will open that here. And this is the main homepage for the Healthy Farm Index Biodiversity Calculator on the Organic Center's website. If you scroll down to the bottom of this page, you can either click on the image or click on the link, and it will open up a web app version of the Healthy Farm Index. The index is written to and designed to kind of walk you through the process of monitoring and planning for biodiversity and ecosystem services on your farm. The focus first is here on the left-hand side, and we talk about first here how it works. So there's 3 stages in doing this. There's selection of weights, selection of targets, and then entering the current data for your farm. The weights represent the objectives that we talked about before, so the value-driven statements. The targets represent, for each indicator, where you want to be. And then finally, the current data represents where your farm is, and this is what you will put in at the end. The intention is to walk through each of these stages deliberately and take your time thinking about your farm, thinking about your priorities, your values, and kind of where you want to be in the long run. So I'll walk through the process once here, but it's meant to be a deliberative, thoughtful process. So it takes a little bit of time. There is some information in there. We've tried to limit the number of indicators and the number of choices, but ultimately it does take a little bit of thinking in order to get through. So we're going to go here first to the selection of weights. The weights represent those values that we talked about earlier, where how important is something to you. There are 2 tabs for weights, one for biodiversity and a second for ecosystem services. And these reflect how important each indicator is. So this is that value statement. So you could say, for me, it is important to have a high crop diversity. So I'm going to raise this. Having livestock as part of my operation is less important to me. I like birds, but I find plants are more important, and pollinators are essential. Um, Number of landscape types, I'm okay with something relatively simple. Percent of my farm is non-crop is challenging, but I do like rare habitats. So you can go here and then you can submit those weights, and it gives you a value here of 104 and kind of shows how those weights are distributed across. So, crops and pollinators are more important on your farm than livestock and percent non-crop. However, this provides a check that your weights need to equal 100. This forces you to kind of recognize that there are trade-offs in um, what you might manage a farm for. So we might take a little bit here off of crops. We might take a little bit off of pollinators, a little bit off here, and then we can submit those weights again, but we came in at just under, so I'm going to pull my pollinators back up. And that's close enough. Next, we move to ecosystem services, and we do that same thing. And so we might say yields are important. Having different market opportunities on my farm, so having multiple sources of income is less important. I do think it's important that waterways are buffered, keep clean water, protection of my fields, continuous living covers, less important to me. I would like to be satisfied, and ownership is key. Here, clearly we've come in a little bit high, so we have to come back and kind of take some of the prioritization off of these. And again, as long as you're close to 100, you're okay. For more information on these specific indicators, we do have a resources page here at the end, which has some discussion of the indicator selection and the NEB guide, and we'll be writing another brochure that kind of complements that complements the web guide here, which can provide more information on individual indicators. Alright, so we're happy with our weights. Next, we're going to move on to our targets, and these are two more tabs over here. Tab targets for biodiversity and targets for ecosystem services. These targets represent where you want your farm to be in the future. Like, what would be the ideal number of crops on that you plant? If you're a corn, soybean farmer who maybe includes alfalfa periodically, maybe you want to move from 3 to 5. If you currently have pigs and chickens, maybe you want to add goats and something else, and so 4. Here, how many bird species can you identify on your land? We'll say you can identify 5 plants. You can, you can identify 5 now, and you would like to be up to 20. Plants, you would also like to be near 20. Pollinators, you're happy with 5. Landscape types, you're at 4 now. You'd like to be at 8. You'd like to actually maybe have 30% of your farm as non-crop habitat. And then currently you only have a small percent of it as rare, but you'd like to see that increased. So you can go through, you can submit those targets, and then we come back here for targets for ecosystem services. What yields compared to the average? You want to be at 100% of your average. You're going to put your market opportunities at 1, because that's kind of where you are right now, and you're happy with that. You want to see 80% of your waterways buffered. You want all of your fields to be protected. 40% under continuous living cover. You want to be more satisfied with your farm, and you'd like to own 100%. You can submit your targets. And the last thing we do is we enter the current data for your farm. So we'll say you plant 3 crops, you have 1 species of livestock, 10 birds, 15 plants, and this is the first time you have to take real data from your farm and go back and submit that. Here, number of pollinators, landscape types, percent non-crop, and percent rare. We do the same thing for ecosystem services. Your yields this year were a little below average. You're at 1 for your market opportunities. Your buffering, say 60%. 80% of your fields are protected. Continuous living cover, you're at 60. You're happy with your farm, but not all the way. And you own 60%. Hit calculate our Healthy Farm Index values, and we can look at some of our scores here. So this summarizes where you're doing well on biodiversity and where you have some work to go. So the higher the bar, the closer it is to your target. If it hits 1, it means you've reached that value. So we can look here, our percent non-crop and our pollinators. We've hit our targets. Some of these other ones we have some ways to go. So our livestock is one we want to improve, and percent rare. We can look at the same numbers for ecosystem services. We've actually already surpassed our target for continuous living cover, so we're doing well there. But we would like to own more of our land. Our yields are slightly below where we want to be. This kind of gives you, looking at these figures, helps you recognize what you're doing well and where you want to improve. What you could do next is say, okay, I'm going to choose one of these and focus on improving that. So I'm going to focus on waterways that are buffered here, number 3. And for the next year, this will be my conservation or management priority. We've set up a way to summarize and report these results. This page can be printed off and included in your annual organic inspection. It can be printed off and filed away and kind of compare for later. We're hoping to set up a way for you to actually submit this data, and we can monitor and help maintain that for you in the long run, but we're not quite there yet. But the table here gives you 3 values, and so it gives you scores for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and then an overall healthy farm index. These 3 scores represent the weights, the targets, and the current biodiversity for your farm. And so they're an aggregate multi-criteria index. A higher score says you are closer to your goal, but a higher score doesn't mean it's necessarily better than another farm. This score reflects the objectives, the values, the targets of an individual farm. And so you have to be cautious about how you report those numbers. We also have a table that summarizes all the data that you input here, where for each of the 15 indicators, the weights that you set, the targets for this particular year, and then where that current data is. And then it sums out the score here for what that is. This score is what's used in the biodiversity and the Healthy Farm Index scores. These targets and current values are what we saw previous when we're looking at this biodiversity and ecosystem service scores. So what's next? Well, first, we'd actually, if you're interested in helping us understand how using the Healthy Farm Index changes knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, and ultimately changes the adoption, increases the adoption of pro-environmental behaviors, we'd love to have you participate in our long-term project here. And so you can click this link. It actually has a space to submit these 3 values, which will help us track your farm over time. But on a more individual level, we see this as a process where you might use the Healthy Farm Index on an annual basis. It's meant to take half an hour to an hour to kind of walk through and complete. But the thought is that you would come back and reflect on those values each year and say, okay, in 2016, this is what I was doing well at. In 2017, I made these changes, and here's how my scores changed. I think the long-term process of doing this is what's going to change some of the social norms, the perceived behavioral control, and ultimately the habits. question often comes up is, how do I accomplish that? How do I get those particular targets? We've put some resources here from a couple of different agencies, and we'll continue to build this up as we see good resources. The Wild Farm Alliance has a nice brochure that talks about what are some practices you can do. So ideally, you could put in, implement some of the practices from the Wild Farm Alliance or from the NRCS or some of these other sources, and then use the index to track the success of your management decisions. So, kind of summarizing what we have here in the Healthy Farm Index, the online calculator is set up to help you track changes over time. It doesn't tell you what to do. Like we said, we've tried to put some information under resources in order for you to get there, but really its value is tracking that change over time. And we see this as part of, like we said, an adaptive management process where, here we're helping you plan and evaluate kind of what's been done, where do you want to be, what are your indicators, what are some outcomes you'd like to see. These other resources can help you do that, but then we can help you evaluate, the index and help you evaluate the success of that. In reality, you're going to have to adjust, and then you do this again, and then you go back and evaluate and learn. But by monitoring these changes over time, you'll be able to better communicate how effective you were at those particular practices. And lastly, just to speak briefly here as to how this aligns with the new organic guidelines, biodiversity has always been part of organic farming. It's in the original documents, but there hasn't been a lot of specificity about what needs to be done or how it should be done. One example that I've seen is, here, are conservation measures noted as part of the farm management plan? Yes or no? As a system that is defined to conserve biodiversity, in January of this year, 2016, the USDA published new guidance on biodiversity conservation on organic operations. Again, a great resource to kind of say, here's some things I can do. But the Healthy Farm Index might be an effective way for you as a farmer, for you as a certifier, for you as a researcher to help track these implementation processes. As we said, a farmer could put those values in and then print that last page and include it in their annual certification process. We do recognize that the current set of indicators don't overlap exactly. We don't have a strong soils component. Again, soils we thought there were good assessment tools out there for that, but we are considering tweaking or adjusting or reframing a updated version of the Healthy Farm Index, perhaps give it a different name that would more closely align with these specific guidances. And so watch for that hopefully in the near future, because our goal is to help farmers and help certifiers implement these practices and track whether or not the guidances benefit local and regional conservation efforts. Alrighty. I always like to end with this quote from Wendell Berry. Agriculture and conservation, agriculture and biodiversity go hand in hand. And if we can recognize that that there is that we need to move past this idea of conflict and move towards working together, we'll be much more successful in sustainable farming practices, promoting organic, increasing the value of farmland to conservation. These are all complementary goals. I think Wendell Berry summarized that better than most people. I do want to thank a long list of collaborators, cooperating farmers, and then our funding agencies. Most recently, the UNFI Foundation, the Organic Center, for kind of helping jumpstart this again. Lots of helpful photos from people, and if you have questions, I will, you can Google the Healthy Farm Index Organic Center, and my contact information is on there. My email is john.quinn@furman.edu. We're always interested in helping people out. If you have ideas as to how this could work better or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. With that,